Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Jose Duarte. Jose is the head of performance marketing at Pangea Money Transfer. Jose, thanks for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking
Uh,
forward to it.
my pleasure. We have a couple of very interesting topics. The one you socialized with me, and I'm very stoked to get into those topics and talk about it for the next 60 minutes or so. But before we do that, can you give a brief introduction about yourself, Jose, what you do, what your role is, and a little bit about your company if you'd like to?
Yeah, so for the last couple of years, I've been at Pangea Money Transfer. It is an international money transfer company, app-based company for people to send money back home to Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, Latin America, and 20 other destinations. My job there has been to kind of take over our user acquisition and try to get as much growth as possible and uh, work cross-functionally with all the teams to fix all sorts of issues based on some expertise that I brought in from before. So before joining Pangea, I was co-founder and head of marketing at Quora. It was a fintech aimed at college students. So we built an app for them to be able to access small ticket loans and manage their finances easily. And before that, for 7 years, I was a bunch of different titles at a startup called Dose and Sparts at a time as well. It was an online media company that we did a number of different things, but mainly we ran viral websites. So the two biggest ones were OMG Facts, Gives Me Hope, and MuggleNet, which was one of the biggest Harry Potter fan sites in the world. While I was there, I did all sorts of things. I ran social media. I was editor in chief of OMG Facts. I helped produce a TV show. I uploaded our apps when we subcontract them from outside. So it was a very interesting potpourri of job description there. But really, what we did there was we try to figure out how things went viral and why, and try to apply that to ourselves and to our clients eventually. And so that was very formative for me and kind of my marketing journey and in learning how to, how to do growth and how to get users for apps and how to build apps.
Lovely. There's so many things you said there is very interesting to me. And, we have 60 minutes. Sometimes, a lot of times our podcasts do run over. I'm going to ask you when we get there if you have more time to talk about some other things. But without further ado, that's a fantastic introduction. You have a rich, broad set of things that you've done. We'll jump into one of the two topics that you had shared with me before we hit record, how using Cloud Code to ship software without being a coder. There's a number of things to talk about there, but I'll just let you kick this off.
Yeah.
What are some initial thoughts, and then we'll go from there.
So last year, Q4, we had our quarterly goal revision, and it was very refreshing because one of the goals was just figure out how to use AI, and it was very open ended because there was this recognition that nobody really knows how we should be using AI, so we just it was open ended, figure out and come back and tell us what you found. And I had already been using AI for work for the last year and a half, 2 years, just performance marketing, just using ChatGPT and copy pasting screenshots of spreadsheets to try to get it to interpret them for me, right? So I just wanted to do something different. And talking to the product team and the engineering team, they had just shipped a feature in record time, and I asked them, how did you guys get there so fast? And they told me they had prototyped using Lovable, which is it's an online platform
Right, yep.
for vibe coding. And so I decided to start playing with it. That was around mid-December. And the thing that I wanted to build that was different, I work in performance marketing. My kind of where I cut my teeth and where my deepest expertise is in Meta. And one of the things about Meta is when you place an ad on Meta, you may place literally the same PNG for your ad, right? You may place it, for example, for me and Pangea, I may place it for the Mexico audience and for the small send audience and for the big send audience and for the Colombia audience and in Spanish and in English. And because Facebook bills you at the impression level, all your data becomes very fragmented for that ad, right? So for example, one of the ones that we have is one where we compare how our rates are better than our competitors. We call them the podiums because it looks like we're in the podium, right? So I placed that podium ad in 3 campaigns, 5 ad sets, and so I have 15 line items of that ad's performance, which is great if you're a media buyer because you can see clearly this audience, how that's resonating, etc. But for me as a performance marketer, there was this extra layer that I couldn't go back to my creative team and talk to them about how their ads were doing, because I would just go like, well, the podiums are doing well in Colombia, but they're not doing well in Mexico. But when we have, and there were so many caveats that then it was so fragmented. And it's really not a problem that nobody really cares to fix, because like I said, the media buyers like the fact that it's fragmented like that. The accountants like that it's like that. The data scientists don't care as long as the data comes in. So I used Lovable to build a tool. I figured out how to connect to the Facebook Ads API. Was able to pull down ads data, and so I added this layer of creative, and so I built a little tool that let me.
Hey, Jose, sorry to interrupt you there. The question I want to ask you was, you said you set up some things on Meta, right? The performance, the campaigns on Meta, essentially. And then you mentioned Lovable, where you're going to start, you actually build something internally. Just so I follow the trail very specifically, what is the workflow? What are the sequence of things, right? What do you actually have on Meta? And you mentioned APIs, integrating Meta APIs. If you could just speak to them as specifically as you want to, that'll be awesome.
So maybe let me explain what the before world looked like, right?
Perfect.
So what I used to do, as I mentioned, I have the same ad the data split up amongst 5 line items. I would download a CSV, create a pivot table, and then manually add kind of all the metadata that I wanted. So we encode a lot of metadata in our ad name. So like an ad name might have the country, the targeting, the tactic, the ad name, and all that stuff. So I would manually code that into a spreadsheet, then pivot table, and now suddenly I'm able to join the 5 line items into one, and now I can see the true performance of the ad.
Okay.
And so now that I have that, I can get not only the top level performance, I can also benchmark it against, for example, the one that I would typically do would be each individual ad in that campaign compared to what the campaign average would do, right? So I would say this ad, based on the competition, this ad was 100 and this ad was a 50, and grade them so on and so forth.
So essentially you're trying to identify the efficacy of your ads, so you know how much money is being spent on what kind of ads and which ones are giving you the highest return on investment, correct?
Right, especially because in Facebook, just because one ad is ranked first and one is at ranked second, the difference between the performance can be very, very big. So it's very important not just to know the rank order, but also the magnitude of the differences, which is why I had this custom, scoring system that I developed. I took a bunch of different metrics, and it was so complex to do, or so manual to do with the pivot tables and all that I really only did it maybe once a month, once a quarter, or if for whatever reason I felt like I needed to do it at the moment. And so what I was able to do with Lovable is set up a database, a super base to get all the relevant data that I wanted, the impressions, the clicks, the spend from the Meta Ads API. And so once I was able to download that, I was then able to add another layer to my database where I was able to say, okay, this 5 line items actually belong to the same ad or to the same creative. And so now that you know that they belong to the same creative, you can automatically, add the spend, add the clicks, add the impressions, so that I can compare what the podiums ad does against the price compare ad or whatever other creatives we had on the market.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about that, right? So you were doing a few things manually, right? You mentioned the pivot tables. Was it like on Google Sheets or something?
Google Sheets or Excel, depending on the day.
So you did that and it was laborious. So you said you did it once a month, but you wanted to be able to do that more frequently. So the first thing is you needed to build a tool, correct? You intended to build an internal tool. Now, this is, and your background, is that as a software developer, Jose, or as do you come from a different background?
No, yeah. So I have always, I've worked in tech companies for years, but I would say, I told someone else the other day, if you drop me in the middle of a deserted island and I had to code to get out of the island, just leave me there. Like I wouldn't be able to do anything. I'm familiar with code. Like I've worked as a product manager and as a project manager, and I've written user stories for developers, but actual, fingers on keyboard, I just cannot. I've flunked out of a couple of Swift courses when I try to be
No, the
an
reason I
iOS
ask
developer.
is actually your background then becomes the most important for our
Yep.
conversation. So I'm sure people are going to be super eager to know how exactly you went about doing this. And I'll give you a little bit of context to why I'm asking this, but I'll give you the
Yeah.
context as a follow up to what I'm going to ask you now and your response as opposed to bias you by giving you the context. So you have the background where you're an engineer, but you're not necessarily a coder, but you identified a problem here and you're like, hey, I don't want to do this manually every time. And I'm not able to do it frequently because I can only do it once a month. So I need to make this better, right? So you identified a
Hmm.
problem, which is step number one, right? Now, after you identified the problem, what made you pick a tool like Lovable, for instance, right? For instance, I'm sure you looked at a few different options out there. What were some of the options you looked at, and why did you actually narrow down on using this as the tool of choice?
So yeah, so I was doing research on some of them. I think Perplexity was one that I looked at, and the one that I eventually moved into, which was Claude Code. The reason I picked Lovable is I knew that I was going into something that I was unfamiliar, which was actual coding. And from everything I saw, it seemed to me that Lovable was a good training wheels, so that
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to screw up too much on certain things, or that it was geared towards people who are just kind of starting off vibe coding. And so that's
Perfect,
why I
right?
picked
Okay.
Lovable. And yeah, and so it kind of went from just using Lovable, because Lovable kind of looks like it's like basically ChatGPT with a web browser
Right.
on the side as it builds things for you, right? So I went from that to then connecting Lovable to GitHub, so that now I could actually have my code outside of
So why
Lovable.
not?
And
Like, for instance, the reason I ask is why not? Did you look at Cursor at the time when you were doing this?
I don't remember if I looked at it super closely. I think just because I had heard that our product team had used Lovable so effectively, and because there's procurement and rules at work, I figured it was easier to just use what they had
Makes
used
sense,
than
right?
to
I
use
think
something
that's
else.
fair enough,
Yep.
right? So you arrived at a tool. You're like, you know what? I'm going to go with this. So the next question I want to ask you is, you know the problem. In other words, it's not a business team that came in and told, hey, Jose, here is a problem. Go build some software. It's you yourself identified
Yeah.
the limitations of a process that you were following and you want to make it better. So you are your own product manager, so to speak, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I was starting off. I heard this somewhere. I forget where years ago, and it's always stuck with me that the best business ideas are always automating someone's spreadsheet. So I was like, hey, I'll automate my own spreadsheet.
Makes sense, right? Because you're making it more efficient and you're not manufacturing a problem. There was a real problem and you want to make your life better, right? So perfect setup here. Now, the first thing is you said you used pivot tables and did it a certain way in the past, correct? Did they become your requirements for what you are building? Or did you actually intend to do it differently because you're like, you know what, I did it a certain way because I couldn't do it any differently or better using what tools were available to me prior. But if I'm going to build something new, I'm actually going to do it differently. What was the approach that you took there?
So I did start the initial, let's say, the initial scope idea I had was pretty much to replicate what I was doing. I think it's not that it changed along the way. It's more so that as I learned to do more and as I figured out what was possible, the ideas of what I could do became more expansive. So, for example, the idea that I mentioned of how every ad I back into a score, I call it the benchmark score, and like I said, I was able to do it once, and I compared a line item or like an ad against its campaign. What I was able to do now that I had this tool set up, now, if you think about the score as being the numerator being the campaign that you're evaluating, and the benchmark being the denominator of what you're evaluating against, I was able to swap in whatever denominator I wanted as many times as I wanted. And so something that I was only able to do once a month or once a quarter, I was not able to do in real time as many times as I wanted and as many angles as I wanted. And so
which means,
it wasn't something that yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say, it wasn't something that I set out from the beginning to do, but once I realized, once I got to the ending point of much faster than I anticipated to where I had wanted to be, I was like, okay, so now what else can I do? And so that a lot of the things that I've learned vibe coding or coding with AI have just been, looking at the empty prompt and just wondering, like, I wonder if it'll do that. And usually
Amazing.
it does.
So in other words, just to recap as we go along, right? Because the idea behind is you're an incredible person to have this conversation with, because there's a lot of people who aspire to be doing what you're doing with a similar background, right? Hey, I've not done coding or not done a lot of coding, and I want to be able to help out here, which is why I'm very excited to asking you these very specific questions. And thanks for your patience and humoring me there.
Of course, no, of course.
So you started with whatever you were doing currently. You said, let me start with that as a requirement. I'm not going to be creative necessarily, not yet. As I build, as I see things happen, I'm going to add more into the mix, which is, there's no better way of doing it, because sometimes we over-engineer the problem and try to make things do more than they probably need to do, correct? So the follow-up question as I go through this list here is, you had an interface or whatever it is that you were doing on Google Sheets or Excel, for instance. Did you jot that down? Like, did you create a mock-up or a wireframe or the user interfaces? What were those initial steps? Did you start like, let me start seeing how this works? Or did you spend a day or a few hours trying to figure out what this thing should look like and how I should go about doing this?
So I think this is one where probably my expertise or like my background helped me, because I'm very much a UI UX nerd. So I did have in my head what I wanted, but for kind of the framework that I go about before I start building anything, it's funny because I was researching what it was called, and it's called the Rumsfeld quadrants, and so it's from back in the Iraq War. Donald Rumsfeld was talking about the Iraq War.
I was going to ask her that. It sounded like that's the last name, but I didn't want to be prejudged.
Yeah, they made fun of him at the time because it sounds funny, but he talked about, your knowledge in 4 quadrants. So he talked about the known knowns, which are the things.
I know that. Oh, the known knowns and the unknown unknowns and the unknown unknowns.
Exactly.
Okay,
so
sorry, keep going.
I keep that very much in mind, especially as once I started this journey of coding with AI. One of the things that I didn't want to do is end up in Reddit with somebody just pointing and laughing at me that like, oh, look at this guy. He left his API key public and now he's racked up thousands of dollars, right? Like I didn't want to do that. So whenever I start thinking about things for like my setup, and we can get into like my vibe coding setup later, but I'm kind of thinking about those 4 quadrants. And so it's like, okay, so my known knowns are the things I know, right? And so the things I know the best are, like you said, what is the business problem that I'm trying to fix, right? That is something that I know better than maybe like a development team would have known before.
Absolutely.
If I have to deliver this as like business requirements, right? So that is for sure. I know best. I know, like I said, I know UX UI because I've worked a lot in that before. So I'm a little bit more comfortable just vibe coding that. And actually, one of the things that's been really helpful vibe coding is everything goes so fast that I can prototype really fast, and I can try weird little UI UX things that I've always wanted, and like I wasn't sure if they were gonna work, and take inspiration and build off of that. So I would say the things that like try to maximize those, right? And try to find what is the lever point that you bring to it as an outsider who maybe wasn't technical and now doing technical things. So like I said, for me, it was like the business logic, right? Then the known unknowns are things that I know I don't know. And I think this is where maybe a lot of people falter because they come in with a lot of bravado of like, okay, AI coding now solved everything. So now I don't have to know coding, right? But this is where I think there's a little bit of humility that you have to bring to it. And so when I set up my agents and when I set up my vibe coding setup, I know that there's things I don't know. So I try to set it up in a way that the AI will catch it, or that will, either proactively or reactively. So for example, whenever I write technical specs with AI, right? I have an AI agent that writes all the user stories to work on the software. The next step I do is I have an adversarial review of the user stories. to make sure that there was nothing that I didn't know, or there was nothing that that was missing technically from there, that maybe the AI coding just got too excited. And by using the adversarial lens, then it uncovers things and it uncovers bugs proactively. I know I don't know a lot of Swift. I know I don't know a lot of database security. So the products that I'm building, I'm trying to make sure that they don't have a lot of dependencies, that they don't require a database, that they don't require constant server connections. And so kind of trying to limit my scope that way, I think has helped me gone faster. And by doing that, it also has helped me do more complex things over time. The third one is...
It's absolutely amazing. Keep going, yeah.
The third one is unknown knowns. So those are things that you don't know that you knew. So for me in this case, it's been, I knew a lot more about software architecture than I realized. And so part of the, maybe I didn't know how to code and how the things went, but I kind of, the way I talk about it with the coding guys, I was like, I know how the cake layers are supposed to go. And so knowing what to ask for, or, a lot of times getting into fixing, debugging like CSS things, which are usually just layering. And so I'm like, hey, are you sure you didn't put this in the wrong? And so knowing a little bit more of that, my advice for this is, these are probably things that you just figure out intuitively through doing your other work, right? So for me, having been around developers for so long, being an Apple nerd for so long, kind of gave me a lot of intuitive knowledge about these things. And so those are, for me, not necessarily things to feel overconfident about, but threads to pull. So a good example for me that happened is I had this agent that I called the atomizer because it helped me make my code smaller. A couple weeks later, I found out this is a very common pattern. Don't repeat yourself, and all these kind of very common code hygiene patterns that I had just kind of backed into from years of being exposed to it, but not having a name for it, right? And so once I realized that's what I had, I started pulling on the thread, and I started learning more about it. And I started being able to incorporate more of those concepts into my process.
Okay.
And then the last one is obviously...
So the unknown knowns are nice. They're good actually, right? Because you didn't know you knew them, and it kind of helps you, and it's sort of like a bonus. You didn't expect to move as quickly, but those unknown knowns help you chug along faster. So it's a nice thing, correct?
Right. And then, like I said, if you pull on that thread, it usually helps you go faster, because there may be something that was like on the edge of your skills and knowledge that helps you go further.
So of the 3 quadrants we've spoken so thus far, let's go to the 4th one. Would this be the best thus far? Like compared to the known knowns and the known unknowns, so the unknown knowns are the nice things?
Yes, I think so. And then the unknown unknowns, like the things you don't know, right?
The scariest part, right? The scariest part.
This is where the disaster lies, right? But usually where the best learning. This is like, oh my God, Quad Code deleted my home folder kind of kind of situations that happen, right? So for this one, I think it's a little bit similar to that one, right? Because like in the process of hitting these walls, you're gonna learn. I would say the
But how do you prepare for those, Jose? How did you prepare for the unknown unknowns, correct? Because the other 3, fair enough, right? We can make a judgment there. But the last one is, what did you tell yourself as, hey, what should I be watching out for? Because I don't even know what to watch for, because they are unknown unknowns.
So I think one of the things that helps is, having a process that you repeat in small steps. My process feels very similar to what a typical agile team would run, right? Like if it was a full team. So having those step-by-step processes helps me, any mistake or any error or any unknown helps me catch it before I spend the AI spent 20 minutes coding, right? So having that small step. Once I got into Quad Code, I also started having the AI figure that out for me. So for example,
hang on, I'm going to interrupt you there. I got a good sense of the quadrants there. So let's go just chug along from where we were before the quadrants, right? So you started on Lovable, right? You had some things in mind. You're like, hey, this is the problem. I have some UI UX experience. I know what this thing should look like. Did you formalize the way, let me step back. Was this a solo project, meaning you were the only one working on it? Okay, right, perfect.
Yeah, so far I've only worked solo, and that's one of the, kind of, like I said, limiting my scope that I'm doing right now, I'm working solo, but and then trying to figure out
But it
ways
gives you the
to bring in other
flexibility to
people.
change courses as well, correct? You're
Of
not
course.
going through a formal process necessarily. Okay, now that you got started, you're like, you have this user interface in mind. Did you use a tool, or what was, if you did use a tool at all, did you mock this up front, or did you actually let the tool come into shape organically, meaning not worrying about how this thing should look like, or where the button should be, what the color should be, and so on and so forth?
It was a mix. I think since it started at Lovable, like I said, Lovable is great for just quick preview, right? And as you type, it changes things on the side. So it feels very much like you are using a mockup tool a lot of times because it is so instant and so fast. There were times where I would maybe sketch things. I like to sketch, I like to draw by hand. So I would sometimes sketch ideas, but I would say this was the area where I knew the least, but I also it was the most energizing for me because like I said, I like UI UX. So the fact that I was able to just throw away the page and start new and
Okay, and then also
test the new.
you're building this for yourself, correct, to be able to do things better. So
Yes.
there is not a different stakeholder who had to be appeased by this user interface, correct? As long as you are
At this time,
satisfied, you're
not.
good to
Yeah.
go.
I was trying to make it in a way that I could release it to other people and for them to either consume or make. So the ultimate idea that I have that I'm building towards is an automated report that can pull our Facebook data, update the data for like the last week, and have AI automatically write the reports. And like I'm pretty far along with that. And so I did have external users in mind as I was building it. But yes, in the beginning, it was purely just to satisfy
But did that play a
myself.
role? The fact that it might become more generic than you had initially imagined, did that influence any of your decision making, or did you just do it as though it was just going to be you going to be using this?
In the beginning, it was pretty wild. It felt almost like I was tinkering, and like I was in a garage tinkering, and I had this machine with like the wires exposed, and the wheel was here, and it was all over the place. And through the process of showing it to people and working on it and getting to work on the features, I did feel like I was formalizing, and it was kind of starting to take shape and getting more compact into something that could maybe ship. But like I said, that part was, if it was a different and for different projects that I've had, I do have something more formal in mind. I think for this one, because it was the first time, because I was experimenting, and because the data problem itself wasn't the hard part, right? Like like getting data and calculating it differently is not that hard. It was more so in discovering what the best UX for doing this analysis was. And so
Okay,
that one
perfect,
was not
right?
something that that's not something that I necessarily knew, right? So like once you have the data, like I had it in pivot tables before, but that was because that's Excel. Now that I have the data in a computer, I can make graphs, I can make all sorts of things with it, right? And not just tables. And so discovering what that looked like was not something that I don't think I could have necessarily figured out before, just because it was so new. That analysis that this tool was unlocking was so new in what it was allowing me to do.
Perfect, right? So we are chugging along. I'm trying to imagine this tool that I have not seen before, but the way you explain it, Jose, it's actually it's taking shape in my mind. I'm sure in our audience's mind as well. So let's go further. Now, if I asked you this tool for somebody who does not know a whole lot about it, right? If let's say between the split between the front end and the back end, I'm intentionally trivializing some of this just to be able to digest the high level picture
Mm-hmm.
here. Is this more front end leaning, meaning there are apps and solutions that you build where it's very heavy on the user interface, but what's happening in the back end, it's not rocket science, right? It's fairly straightforward, but you're enriching the data to present it in many different forms and shapes. That's one extreme, one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is you could go look at an app, you'd be like, oh my god, this thing is terrible because it looks very basic and simple because there are two pages and they don't seem to do a whole lot, but probably it's a lot more back end heavy, meaning it collects a bit of information, but there's probably a whole lot of beautiful algorithms that work in the back
Right,
end.
right.
But those are two ends of the spectrum, and there's everywhere in between. If you have to kind of put this app that you're working on, where would that lean? Because I'm asking this so I can ask my next set of questions based
Of
on
course.
your answer.
I would say it's definitely more on the front end side of things. Um, the back end was tough for me, but I think it was simple. I think it was more so because of my limitations, right? Because the back end, the hardest part of the back end is, or the hardest part for me was figure out an efficient way to not get rate limited by the Meta API.
Oh no, we're going to go
So
there. I promise you, we're going to go there.
yeah,
I'm going to ask you more specifically. But
of
so which
course, of
means
course.
it's leaning on the UI. But if you have to just, let's say if I have a big line here and this is like UI, and how closer to one
I'll
end of the
say
spectrum is it?
it's 70-30 UI.
Perfect, right? Makes sense to me. So now you're like, okay, the UI is important because, it's not just for you. As other stakeholders come into play,
Mm-hmm.
like, let's make sure that this thing actually works and this thing works well enough to make me more efficient. Now, given that it was leaning more on the UI, not that it matters, in your initial hours or days of working, did you try to build one part of it first and then not worry about the other? Or did you say, you know what, I'm going to have one page show up with it working completely as opposed to four pages that look pretty but are not functional? What was your approach?
So I did know that I did know my known unknown was that I knew the sync function was going to be the hardest part, and that getting the data cleanly in a database was going to be the hardest part. So I worked really hard on getting that in first, and then once I had everything in cleanly and like I wanted to, then figure out the UI, the UX, the transformation side of things.
You've
So
already
my
said
first
something there which is going to benefit not just folks who are entering the workforce or newer developers or people who are switching careers. I think you said something there, Jose, is extremely important. So I just want to stress that, just repeat it. I'm not going to add any more value than you already said, but I'm just going to repeat it for whatever it's worth. You said that you picked, they say, right, a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So you
Mhm.
picked the most difficult of the problems as you perceived it, right? And worked on that problem. I want to say this because I've been doing this for a long time. And while some things are obvious to some of us, or some things are obvious to us at some points of time, not all things are obvious to everybody at all times, correct? That's just the way life works. And I've worked with a lot of people, incredible engineers and people who play different roles. Sometimes I've seen them address the easier of the problems in the interest of showing progress to
Mhm.
whoever it is that they're reporting to, right? Now, there could be other things outside of engineering that come into play there. But if you took out the politics of things, if you took out the growth and career and all of these types of things, a lot of us, as engineers, we sometimes don't care for. If you took at the core problem in itself, I think it's important to pick the hardest problems, right? You might be
Mhm.
like a weekend and people are like, Jose, what's going on, right? A week today seems a lot longer than a week was 2 years ago,
Right,
but
right.
regardless, right? But you took the most difficult of the problems that you saw, which is a very important thing to do. So, which means at that point, you didn't even build a UI page at all, correct? You just
Nope.
worked on, okay, can you speak more to that specific problem and we'll dig deeper into that.
Yeah, so the problem with the sync was, first of all, like I said, Lovable is very UI focused. So the backend, it does have a pretty good setup with it sets up a super base backend for you and all that. But then you still have to go, you still have to go to Meta to create a Facebook app so that you can get your API key. So I had to figure that out. So
But Jose,
it was a
that
lot.
doesn't have, just to be clear, I mean, that is not so lovable related, right? Doesn't matter which
No,
tool you
you
use, you
still
would
have to
still
do
have
you
to do
still
the Facebook app
you
regardless,
still have
correct?
to do,
Okay.
yeah, you still have to go do all that. And so then once you do that, then you have to create I think Superbase and Lovable call them edge functions, which live on on the server side. And uh, the level of detail that I required was at the level, at the daily level. So I would get basically like what at A was, the performance of at A on March 16th and on March 15th and on March, so all of that for the entire account. So I was requesting tens of thousands. I couldn't even tell you the number, but tens of thousands of lines from the API. And
Oh no,
I
Jose,
kept,
sorry. I just want to make sure I follow that, right? The Facebook app that you're talking about here would have already been in existence because you were anyways using this. You're creating campaigns on Meta and you're doing it through Google Sheets and pivot tables, right? So
and no. So this is so that was existing, but to actually interface with the Facebook API, you have to create a Facebook app. And because I was doing this as a side project, I didn't want to use the one that we already had set up. So I had to create a new one just to be in a sandbox for my own.
Okay, okay. Because we have
But
one
it's
for Snow,
essentially,
but
yeah,
it's the same thing,
yeah.
right? It's very similar. So let's say you have a Facebook app created, and now there is some data. So Facebook lets you pick all these attributions, right? Hey, you need
Mm-hmm.
permissioning for some things and not for others. So you have to go through a Facebook app setup process. And let's say you
Yep.
got that done, right? I'm not going to worry about that because that's outside the core
Yep.
part of this conversation. You got
Yep. Yep.
that
Yep.
done. And the first thing is you're going to extract data. Did you have to pick attributes that you wanted Facebook to make available to you as part of this exchange?
Yeah, so part of building that sync function was figuring out which fields we needed to call from the Meta Ads API, and Meta has different APIs, and so a lot of that was trial and error of where all the fields were. Because, for example, the you can request the actual image that Facebook serves, but that's in a different API or in a different method than you get the spend data and the metrics data, and so it's very fragmented. And there's a lot of data, right? Facebook exposes a lot of data, but for this one, I was trying to keep it very focused to the 8 metrics that matter the most to us, and so I was having to filter that out, pull that all in
So
from
were
Meta,
you
and then
So Jose, sorry, were you using the Facebook Graph API directly, or were you using an SDK through Lovable that was actually leveraging the API behind the scenes?
no, I built the function because I didn't want any dependencies, and I also didn't want to have to pay extra because there's people who already do this for you, right? I think we
Right.
use our data team uses one I think called Fortran that automatically already connects to Facebook, so it's an easy setup. I was rebuilding it for myself, kind of just because I didn't want to go and pay for an outside vendor to do it, and also just because I thought this was an interesting hard problem for me to solve
Perfect. So you're
with
using the
vibe coding,
Facebook
right?
Graph API. Essentially, you pick the API that was of interest, and then let's say you connected. You got the API key from Facebook. You pick the API,
Yep.
pick the attribution. You got the API key. Now you're back in Lovable. What were some of the initial things that you did to actually before you wrote any code per se, right? Were you trying to experiment to just see what that fetch looks like? Like if I made the request using the API key, how'd that work?
Yeah, the fetch was the hardest part because I that one was one of the biggest either unknown unknowns or known unknowns that I hit because um I basically no matter what I did, I either kept getting rate limited because I was making too many requests, or I was making too few requests that were too big and I was timing out. And I just could not figure out how to do it. I eventually was able to solve it months later, but for this particular case, I ended up doing this, stick and tape approach that just went really, 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 really slow, but also just chunked it in ways that
So hang on, Jose.
I was able
Sorry.
to
So what
finish.
you got back from these calls was a JSON response, I presume, right?
Yep. Hmm.
Okay. So when you got the JSON response, the first question I have is, did you choose to store it the way you received it, or did you normalize it? Like, what did you do with the data as you
So
got
that
it
was
initially?
that was the mistake that I didn't know I was making because I was either basically I wasn't storing it fast enough, and so I was trying to process and store the rows by themselves out of
Okay,
the
what
chunk.
percentage of the response did you kind of need from what it gave you for on a per record
Oh no, I
basis?
was getting 100. I was downloading 100% of what I needed. The problem was that what I needed was too big, and I wasn't effective in processing it. So I was either, for example, I was saying I was getting, you know, at level items per day. So I was either making, if I had 10,000 line items, I was making 10,000 calls, and so I was getting rate
Okay.
limited, or I was calling the 10,000 ads in one JSON blob, but I hadn't figured out how to process that fast enough, and so I was keeping the API connection open with a JSON blob kind of just saved on memory instead of in storage, and I was
But on
also
the
getting
lovable side, Jose, when
yeah
you're making these requests to the Graph API, the Graph client, Graph has the flexibility, unlike REST, where
yep
you can essentially determine what you want to be able to ask through that response, right? So
yep.
the Graph client did Lovable provide a client for you that you could use
No, that
easily?
I was having to figure out how that all worked by myself. There may be some plugin now. I don't know. I haven't been in Lovable in a couple of months, but no, at the time, at least as far as I understood it, I was just working with the coder AI to figure out how to how to build a function from scratch. And
And
so
then what
that was
language
the,
were you? Okay, makes sense, right? And what language
I
were
think it
you
was
using?
TypeScript, I think is
Okay,
what
perfect.
I was
I'm with you
using.
so far. We've gone as far as setting up the Facebook app, the getting the API key, and you're getting some JSON response back. You got the data. You had some initial issues with how much to get. Is it too much, too little, rate limits, and all
Yep.
of those things, right? Is it like 429? One of those, too many requests error. I don't remember the error code, but one of those error codes
Yep.
essentially, right? You figured that out, and now did you store after you figured that out? Did you store everything that you received locally, or like in your database, or did you only store the processed portion of what you received from Facebook?
No, so we requested from the API exactly what we needed, so we didn't have anything left over.
That you
So
didn't
yeah,
need.
everything.
Okay.
So yeah, we just stored everything that we got.
And then when you store them on, like, what is the database that you picked for you to persist this on the?
So Lovable has a kind of pretty well built in integration with Supabase, and so if you request from Lovable anything that would require a database, it automatically offers to create a Supabase instance for you.
Supabase is probably one. I'm not. Is it a database that they support essentially?
Supabase is it's both a open source database environment, and then they also have it's kind of like WordPress, but they also have the managed service.
Okay, no, I was just wondering, is Supabase something on top of like Postgres, or is it its own database in itself, like Supabase?
I believe it's a Postgres. Yeah, I believe it's a Postgres.
Oh, okay, cool. So
But
this is what I
I'm not
figured. A lot of
100%
them
sure.
probably. So in other words, you got the data and you store the data, and then now at this point you have made the initial setup, right? Now you basically are in Lovable. You created whatever you needed on Facebook. You know the API that you wanted. You got the Graph API set up. You have the code to extract the data, and you store the data. Now
Mhm.
you start beginning to process the data and make sense out of data, right? What were some of those next things that you had to do there?
Then I think that's where the both the UI UX and the marketer really started to turn in, because then it was like, okay, so how would I want to see this data as a marketer, right? Oh, it's a time series chart. It's a table that looks like this. It's a gallery of all the ads with their data and things that I can click. And then the one that actually was the biggest unlock, both for me and then as I showed it to the creative team, my scoring system ends up kind of collapsing into two, which is predicting scale and predicting efficiency. So like, how big will something get, and then how efficient will it be when it grows? And so doing that, I was able to map it into a quadrant graph. And so it was very striking to see, because because I downloaded everything from Facebook, I was able to make this quadrant graph where the data points, instead of just being a dot, were the actual pictures of the ads. And then I also sized them so that an ad that spent more was bigger than an ad that spent less was smaller. And so it was very striking to see, what ads were at the top right quadrant that were performing super well, and which ones were in the bottom quadrant, or which ones were inefficient but they were spending a lot of money. And so being able to see that visually was very helpful. And even, like I said, when we talked to the creative team, it took literally 1 second for somebody to say, "Oh, like I guess light blue doesn't work well for us,"
Oh, you want
because they were able to see.
That's
They were
because
able to see.
Sorry, I was just going to say that's because you kind of knew what you wanted, because that's not easy, right? What you did there is very difficult. I mean, I don't
Yep.
want to make it sound any easier, right? You were able to understand the problem and make it visualize itself in a way that other people could understand, correct?
Yep. And like I said, yeah, and so like I said, it took 1 second for them to look at it, because the pictures were loaded and they could see all the light blue ones were at the bottom left, which is the underperforming, and then all the dark blue ones were at the top right. And so I was like, oh, clearly we know which color works for us. And
Makes
so that
sense,
was something
right?
that would have taken so long to find out before. And it sounds so simple, right? Like which color works better for us, but it's like surprisingly hard to figure that out.
No, it is, right? It's one of Albert Einstein's quote, to paraphrase what he said, right? It's very difficult to make things simple. You know what I mean? It's very difficult to make things
Yep.
simple, right? But let me ask you, when you talk about this particular chart, for instance, of the graph, but that's a framework or a library that you found, right? Because there's many ways to represent data. Did Lovable tell you, or how did you figure out like for instance, right? We use AM charts for our product at
Yep.
Snowpal, right? Just as an example. What charting library are you using?
I think that is one of those questions where it's a known unknown, and one where if you just ask, I wonder, if it'll do this, you get surprised. So for this one, I think I just described to Lovable, I want a chart that looks like this, like this, like this. And then it said, oh, for that situation, the best library is this one. And so it suggested a library
Wow.
for me.
Wow. Okay, so that's amazing.
The
And do you know what library it suggested by any chance, Jose?
I believe it's called Rechart.
Okay. Okay. So
Another one that was even more astounding for me was for a different project. I told it, or I think it was for this project. For this page, I would want to see a preview that where I can play around with it without committing too much to the design before it gets into the connection like database. That's all I said. It created and it loaded a library called Storybook, which is like a CSS. It's like a CSS design library.
Design system.
And it created a whole design system that was documented. It documented what a button looked like, what a down button looked like, what a selected button looked like, the typography, the colors, the everything you could think of. And it even made mock-up pages where I could play around and before even committing to design. And that was all for me just wondering, I wonder if it'll do a preview for me. And I thought it was going to make me like a separate dumb HTML page, but really it went and found this library for me.
Wow.
And so that's where that's where I think, knowing that you don't know these things, right? Instead of saying, AI, do this for me, just, hey, I wonder if this is possible. Can you find some options for me? Or like, how could we do this if I wanted to do this?
Yeah, but known unknowns, but I'll call out for a small separation, right? It's known unknowns because you don't exactly know how it might solve the problem that you're wanting for it to solve. But it's not so much a known unknown, and it's a known because you know exactly what the problem is. And you almost know what the solution you're looking for is. You just don't know how it's going to go from A to B.
I just didn't know what the technical solution was.
Yeah, because that's the most important thing, right? And I think it's important to stress that, Jose, because we are entering into this new world where that's the most important skill. The skill is not in writing this code anymore, right? Whether people want to accept it or not. And I say this as somebody who's been writing code for like over 20 years. You know what I mean? If it's hard for somebody else to accept this, it should be just as hard for me to accept that as well, right? But I have to accept it where the truth is, for instance. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think that's where people who are, I think in my position, who we are not technical, kind of entering this role, we have to come at this with a little bit of humility too and understanding. But I do think it's a step change, and I think it's a paradigm shift. And I know a lot of people are skeptical of it because of,
no, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about skepticism in a second, but I want to make sure we finish this.
Yeah, of course.
I just have a couple of more things, right? So you pick it picked the charting framework. You're like, hey, this thing looks cool. I'm good to go. Now, the mapping that needs to happen. Now, you've got some data in your database, right? You got plenty of data, and you want to represent that data into a chart. Now, let's say you have, since you mentioned Postgres, it's a relation database, right? You got a bunch of tables and columns and whatnot. How do you, I'm guessing it's like a drag and drop-ish situation where you say, hey, these are the fields I'm interested in. This is what should go in the x-axis or y-axis.
No, that was actually one of the hardest things to keep Lovable in track. Was it not hallucinating what the proper calculations to get everything sorted were.
Okay.
And so that was one of the biggest challenges, and one of the things that I had to figure out the most was, so for example, CAC, right? It's amount spent divided by how many conversions you get. For us, we have kind of a weird setup just because of the way our business works, where a purchase is not what we track in performance, just because purchase can be somebody that comes in after they've joined for the first time. And for me, in performance, I'm more interested in new user acquisition. So that's a very simple thing to tell a user, or sorry, not a user, an employee, right? And they remember, right? Like, hey, when you see purchase on Facebook, that's not the actual metric. That's just a secondary metric, right? The actual one is trials. And so trials started for boring reasons that we don't need to get into. That's the one that we use. AI, Lovable in particular, kept forgetting about this. And so I would, for example, for that graph, if I would tell it, hey, I want a quadrant graph where CAC is in one line and whatever is on the other, because it has so many patterns in its training of what CAC is. Oh, CAC is dollar spent over purchase, right? And so it would look at my database and it would look, oh, I have this purchase field here. That clearly must be what you use for CAC. and so it would get it wrong. And that would be a constant battle over and over again of it just getting the wrong metrics to calculate. And so what I ended up
but
having
Jose, when you sorry, finish your thought. I have a question there. Go ahead, finish your thought.
yeah, what I ended up having to do there was set up all of my logic so that it would actually refer to a central file where all the calculations were being done. So that no graph, no chart, nothing would calculate its own data, but receive it from a centralized calculator.
Okay, okay, good. So the thing, going back to what you said a minute ago, where you said it kept doing it wrong. Let's say it picked the wrong field, for instance, right? But let me step back. I'm presuming here in our conversation about the database side of things, the last 10 minutes or so, Jose, that you did not actually write a query yourself, correct? You didn't write a
No.
query, right? Okay.
Nope.
You let the tool kind of do what it needed to do. So which means when you say I want this field on x-axis or these fields on y-axis, is that like a drag and drop experience, or was it more like a checkbox where you check what I needed and what I didn't need, you uncheck those boxes?
So for this one, for those graphs, I was already building kind of like a canvas and block system where the report page was a blank canvas and I could drop different blocks into it. So for the particular graph, I had a settings screen where I could choose what metrics I wanted on the axes.
So which was like a checkbox type of UI where you pick and
But
choose,
it was
right?
yeah, but it's not something that Lovable had. It's something that I had to code into my page using Lovable.
You had to code in. So in other words, you wanted to let the user pick and choose what those could be because if you wanted that to be dynamic, for instance, right?
Correct.
Okay. But let's say the thing I'm asking is behind that actually, let's say the user picked 7 of those 10 check boxes. How did the mapping happen between the choices that they made and what the graph ended up picking? You know what I mean? Because my question would still be valid. What I'm asking is, if you wanted 7 of those 10 things, how did you tell Lovable, like, hey, you know what, this is how I want you to draw this graph, right? I want you to take these attributes and plot the x-axis and the other attributes and plot the y-axis, for instance.
So no, for that one, I just picked a smart default. So for me, it was like I said, my system collapses into scale and efficiency. So behind, I already had the logic for I had CAC, CPI, etc., CPM, all of those metrics defined, and then what the scores were. And so when I set it up in Lovable, I set up a canvas and block system. I set it up so that when this block loads for the first time, whatever the current data that we're working with is, load, scale, and efficiency, and then users can change it later.
Okay, which means, however the representation was, each of the charting libraries generally expect you to furnish a JSON the way they want to interpret that, right? Like we use AM charts and we use like 15 different charts, like on the Snowpal app and the website for in web app. We have to map the JSON specifically to how AM charts is going to render a chord diagram or a mind map, for instance. But here, you didn't have to do the mapping between the JSON and the charts.
You're telling me this for the first time.
Wow, it's just incredible, right? So it does the mapping. Now, and then it generates this chart, and then you make these adjustments and accommodations where it needs to be. And let's say, how many times, let's say on an average day, like we break our day by 2 sessions at Snowpal, for instance, Jose, every session is like 4 hours long, right? Like how often did you, 2 questions. How often did you look at the code that was generated by this tool that you're using, Lovable? Let's say you have a question, you go into prompt, you say X, Y, and Z, it does something. Do you look at the code it generates? And if so, how often did you look at the code?
I did not look at the code.
Was there ever a situation where you had to, like, you're like, hey, this thing is buggy or it reports an error and you've had to go into the code to fix something?
Typically, what would most likely happen would be either in the debugging console, I would copy paste the output to help debug with the AI itself. But I can't think of any situation where I had to go in and edit like an actual code file myself.
Which means, can we then say that 100% of the code that this app uses was generated?
Yes.
Incredible. I've been talking to people and anyone says 70%, I'm expecting this, as somebody who's running a company and using a lot of these tools, I'm not surprised. But pretending to not know this, right? Sometimes I have to play the devil's advocate so people actually can appreciate both sides of the spectrum. When I hear 70%, when you tell 70% of the code is generated, a typical developer begins to freak out, right? Because you're questioning 70% of our existence. When you say 80% of the code is generated, you've now begun to question 80% of our existence. When you say 100%, my friend, you're beginning to question the entire existence, right? So I want to wrap this and I want to go to the second part of this, which is
Yep.
incredible. We've gone up to the generating the chart part. Let's wrap up the functionality there.
Mhm.
The last thing here is the deployment. Can you just speak to what you had to do for deploying this? Did you have a lower environment? Did you have multiple like dev, test, staging, production, or was it like since it's internal, it's going from Jose's lovable environment straight to production? How was that set up?
Yeah, well, for this one, actually, I'm still trying to deploy internally because Lovable isn't secure enough for us. So right now, I actually have it deployed on my machine
Okay.
locally, and then I'm working with our development team to deploy
So
it.
finally, so that's a great answer. You found the need for the development team not when you designed the user interface, not when you
Yep.
designed did the UI UX, not when you had to set up the Facebook app, not when you had to determine the Facebook APIs, the Graph API, not when you needed to make the connection to Facebook, not when you needed to persist it into Firebase, sorry, not Firebase,
Yep.
Superbase through Postgres, for instance, not when you had to render the charts, correct? You could do all of this. Like, let me ask you an honest question too. While you are an incredibly sharp guy, right? That's a given. But beyond that, did you ever, during this process of where we've gotten thus far, did you ever need to talk to a developer saying, you know what, I kind of got there, but I need some help here, or I need some help there? Or did you never ever need to talk to a developer?
I would say so. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier of being smart and trying to scope and work around what you know. There are certainly a lot of areas where I know I need to talk to a developer before I go further. I think deploying
No, wait,
deploying
hang
a
on, no, Jose.
SaaS.
My question is very specific, just to not for
Oh,
deploying.
no.
E- Everything
Um,
you did thus far based on what you've conversed here.
no.
Get out of here, man. You're not making our lives easier, Jose. You're not making our lives easier. This is insane. So we are, I want people to digest this and appreciate it because I cannot tell you the number of times I talk to a fellow developer and, we're good people, right? Everybody is good. Sometimes we as humans can be in denial, correct? We don't want to accept reality, right? We're not comfortable accepting reality. I mean, I've talked to so many people lately who've said this. Like earlier, they told me they went up to prototyping, right? So everyone's like, you know
Yep.
what? You can go up to POCs, but not beyond that. But I can tell you, I've spoken to people lately who've gone all the way to production, like literally, right? With users signing up, and which brings us to the second part of the conversation. But I want to pause here. Anything that I did not ask in terms of the flow of things where I missed something completely, you're like, Krish, we need to actually include this in part of the conversation.
No, no, I think you're right, and part of the reason why I think I'm wanting to have these conversations is because it is scary, and I think it will be very disruptive, and I think there is a certain denial because it is scary, but I think it's better to just face it head on and be realistic about what's happening.
There's no other choice, right? What other choice do we got? Okay, perfect. I know I've thrown a bunch of questions at you. I want to ask you a couple more. I want to
Yeah,
be
of course.
respectful of your time as well. How much more time do you have?
We can keep talking.
Okay, tell me when you're tired and then we'll wrap it. But I want to, before I switch to the next segment, Jose, I want to give you a breather for one, because I've thrown questions, always easy to ask questions. So you get a small break before I ask you the next set of questions. Do you want to ask me anything while you catch your breath here?
Um, is there anything that has been more interesting to you, or any thread that you would like to pull more on?
Sorry, ask that again. Sorry, Jose.
Has From what I've talked to you about, is there anything that's been more interesting, or any thread that you would like to pull more
Oh
on?
yeah, yeah. I actually the part right. The let me summarize this a little bit. Good question, right? The reason I asked about the split between the user interface and the backend is, as a developer, even though I'm a full stack developer, at least I want to believe
Hmm.
I am because I do work on both sides of the spectrum. But a lot of us use that word loosely. If I'm a backend engineer and I build a few pages You tend to, one tends to call themselves a full stack engineer, or somebody is a UI developer who does a little bit of back end coding, right?
Mm.
They think, that the term full stack is being generally used very loosely, in my opinion. To me,
Right, right, right.
Krish is a back-end engineer who can build user interfaces. If there is nobody in the team or he has to save some money, he can do it because I've done it. But that's
Mm-hmm.
not my natural habitat, right? You let me go, I will go where I lean towards. And there are some people in my team are incredible UI engineers, and that's where they generally would lean. And they would do if something needed to be done in the back end, otherwise not so much, right? But the reason I mentioned this, seemingly random statement, you might be like, what does this have anything to do with what I said earlier? No, that it's got something to do with it. Is the fact that the more tools we see come into play, or initially, right? Let me say about 2, 3 years ago, or maybe even 4 years ago, right? Have you used any low code, no code tools before you did this particular work, Jose? In the past, right? Have you used any low code or no code platforms?
No, I had it. I mean, probably like ChatGPT to copy paste code into stuff, but
But not
it's so different.
Like Bubble or one of those types of things, right?
No, lovable mid December was the first time I used any kind of AI coding.
The reason I ask that is, right, no code and low code tools have been around for a long time, right? I mean, not
Hmm.
as much, like clearly it's dramatic now, but those low code tools have been there. But why have they not? I mean, they're fairly, I think Appian, APPIN is one of them, Pega is another. I can think of a bunch of them, right? I'm not a fan of any of that. I've never been a fan just as a developer, because one of the main problems I've seen is they were built specifically for non developers. And here is what I mean by that, right? A lot of times you take your problem, you may or may not be able to solve those problems the way you intended to solve those problems using those tools. You then change your problem to accommodate the features of the tools and the platforms. And so what you end up building is a little bit similar to what you had in mind, maybe, but it's nowhere close to what you exactly had in mind, because you had to make those accommodations, right? And that was a big problem. But with the current set of tools available with AI and Cloud Code and whatnot, that is different. You can actually
Hmm.
build what you do exactly want, or even better, like you mentioned, you don't even need to necessarily worry about the nitty gritty details of, hey, what is the JSON? How is it looking like? How should I persist it? How do I write these queries? Are those graph queries? Are those SQL queries? And how do I do the mapping between the JSON structures and the charts, for instance, right? Now it opens
Hmm.
this world up to a larger group of people, correct? Which is where my next set of questions I have for you are, which is,
Okay.
now that more people are doing this, which is amazing, right? It's incredible. But we've got to address one of the elephants in the room to some extent. You probably saw the AWS news from last week or a week ago, right? That they had this outage, and they had this outage repeatedly. So, right? And then I think I saw something on Twitter or X the other day, and yesterday, I think, um, I believe this is what I understand from what I read on X, that AWS might have even told their people that you can't commit any code unless you get it reviewed by a senior engineer in the team, for instance, right? I mean, this is coming from one of the hyperscalers, correct? If some other company did it, people would have brushed it aside and say, you know what, they don't know what they're doing, right? They probably got it wrong. When AWS does it, you cannot be dismissive of
Right.
this. So before I share more about that, what are your thoughts? Like, do you, in your process of building this, do you also have some concerns? While you're happy on one side that you can get it done, it's a, a pat on the back for sure, right? But does it give you concern at some point, Jose, that, hey, I don't exactly know what was generated by these tools that I'm using, and will that cause problems in production?
Absolutely. I think, like I mentioned, so I've worked in fintech for the last 7 years now. So definitely security and privacy and protection is one of the top most important things that's been on my mind in the companies that I worked for a while. That's one of the reasons why I didn't deploy the Lovable tool as it was, just because um, the potential security issues. I couldn't, developers are very busy, so I couldn't get an engineer at the time to take a look at the code and be able to give me some assurance that it could be uploaded without any security holes. So I think it's definitely something that anybody entering into this needs to be mindful of. And so, for example, another thing that I've gotten into since I started that journey, I moved on from Lovable to Cloud Code. I've been working on Mac OS and iOS apps, and so some of the things that I've been trying to do there is make sure that they're sandbox, make sure that they don't need the internet to use, that I'm not setting up a server. So trying to limit the scope of what I know I can do and like what I know is possible for me at this time, I think is very important, and kind of trying to test out the edges of what I can do little by little, and so for and find help when you hit some of those. I think part of the reason why now that I've been able to socialize this tool in the company a little bit more, now I'm starting to get the engineers, hey, let's see about helping you deploy it, let's give you some space in our server, let's do this, let's do that. But I think definitely there needs to be this mindfulness of, yes, the tools are making a lot of really, really cool stuff for us. They're writing a ton of code, thousands and thousands of lines of code that you don't even need to see. But I think because of that, there's this a little bit even more of a responsibility to be a little bit more careful before doing.
So what is the balance in your mind, right? Like, in other words, let's say I asked you a more specific question. You did prompt engineering, you're using a lot of these tools, it generates code, it does what it's supposed to do, meaning visually or functionally. You have already tested, a lot of the tests can be generated as well. But when that happens and the code is generated, is that a point where typically you think, let's say you were in a team of 4 people, for instance, right? Let's say you're working on this together. Is that a point where you think people should chime in and start reviewing the changes? Is that too early? Is that too late? What do you think should be the natural evolution of the software development lifecycle? Because it's not going to look anything like it did in the past. And if people are following the SDLCs of the past, they're just simply doing it wrong, in my opinion, at least, right? So we are starting to change our ways of life and questioning our muscle memory and how we are building software. So as somebody who's doing this, what do you think are some of where do you think an engineer should come into play? At which point in your process of building should they actually be playing a role?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I can give you a good answer to that yet. I'm still trying to discover that, so I'll be making up anything I say. But I think kind of where I'm thinking, like I said, a few things that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to limit my scope as much as I possible, like I've said. Setting up the process to where it's not just about going off and building as many features as I can think of, and trying to limit the scope also of what you're building, so that you can have time to review. One thing that I train all my coding AIs. One of the things that I have on like the Claude.md kind of the instructions is that beautiful code is just as easy to write for you as shit code, and so. as you go down, be careful what you do. And then I have another agent that comments the code and writes protective comments so that other AI coders don't trample it. So I don't know what the answer is on multi-user yet, but I think it's probably going to have to do a little bit with that, of effectively using AI agents to make sure that the coding AIs don't just go in and trample code, but actually read it, are careful about it, that it's annotated, that it's understandable, that it's human readable. I think it's going to be somewhere along those lines.
Important points, right? But I'm going to catch you on the last one you said there and dig a little bit deeper. You said human readable. So that's the important point where probably, right? That's the gray area that I want to come to. See, I've asked this to a lot of people, right? And I don't know if I have a great answer myself. Over the years, we've always generated code, correct? It's not like developers wrote every line of code. We generated the code that we didn't have to write, and we wrote the code that we did have to write. The only thing is the ratio has changed now, where more code is generated than being written. That's the only big difference, but it's not like we've never generated code as developers ourselves. And the reason I mentioned that, Jose, is when we generated code, we typically separated the code that was generated. It was very rarely, if at all, that I can think of, where we had generated code and human written code in the same file, right? We've gone a great lengths, a lot of us and a lot of companies in the architectures and design patterns, to have a clear separation, because if we then used a different tool to generate the code, we know that the impact was isolated to the generated part of the code base. But that's not what's happening these days, right? Even in teams that are writing code and generating code, sometimes there's not much of a separation, to the point that you don't exactly know, or whether, if Jose was a developer or somebody else was a developer, they left the team. you don't know if this code was generated by a human or written by somebody. Now, you've not necessarily edited the code, but if there has to be a scenario where you have to edit the code with humans and machines writing alongside, do you see the need for separation or do you not see the need for separation of that code?
I think not. And so one of the things that I've actually found in this process is making the code more human readable actually helps the AI coders be better at their job too. One of the things, and I don't know if we'll have time to get into the depths of this, but one of my early experiments with iOS was for a travel app for a trip I'm taking actually this week. I'm going to Japan for 2 weeks and I wanted an app. As an experiment, as a side project, I wanted an app for it. And in the process of describing my app to this agent that writes my user stories, I was very descriptive in what the database schema field names were and what the function names were. And to make a long story short, Claude Code built me a fully functional Swift app in 10 minutes of actual coding work, 35 minutes of me talking about what specs I wanted. And because both the comments and the schema were so explicit and verbose in what it was saying, an in-app AI chat integration that I had built in, so separate from the Claude Code, like an AI API key inside the app itself, was actually able to come up with functions on its own, like emergent functions, like how to change a schedule, how to detect conflict schedules between two events. It was able to figure all that out and reason it out just because the database schema was so verbose. So I think that the separation between the human and the generated AI code bases, if you have the proper controls and you train your AI properly, I don't think you'll need to separate them.
Okay, fair points, right? This is amazing, right? I mean, where we are and the conversation we are having and the number of things that are able to get done is remarkable, right? Nobody could have seen this. A lot of us did. Most of us didn't see this coming, for instance. So as we get to the tail end of this conversation, right? Anything so far that we've missed completely in the whole gamut of AI coding, the roles, uh, and whatever else
Yeah.
we've talked about here.
Um, yeah, I think it's easy to see this as just the next step in coding becoming easier, right? Because throughout the history, since computers were invented, right, coding has become easier and easier. I think this is yes, it is about coding becoming easier, but I think it's a paradigm shift that you'd really need to think about to appreciate. So if you think about what software is and our relationship to computers, right? We have our intent, right? Like the business logic, whatever you want your idea in your head of what you want the computer to do, and then you have the computer, which up until now only speaks binary, right? Zeros and ones. And from the beginning, we've had to figure out a way to translate our intent into binary. And so if you think about all the way back, when you had to punch holes in cards and feed them into a computer, that was literally us encoding the zeros and ones, right, with the punch holes.
Right.
And then you go on and you get into C and compilers and into now you have Rust and Swift, which are as close to English as you can get. But the difference is, and I think of this, I don't know if you saw the latest Tron movie, where they had this concept of there was this outside the computer and inside the computer, and there was a barrier, and you could send people across, and you could send computer stuff outside and people inside. And so it's kind of like that, where our intention needed to be transported inside the computer, but before it went in, it had to be translated, right? And the translation was project managers and product managers and engineers writing specs. And so translating the business logic into computer terms. And every time we made an advancement, right, from punch cards all the way to Rust or whatever, it was all about making the translation more efficient. I think what AI is doing is the translation now lives inside the computer. And so it's no longer about, how well is your dictionary? How well are you? How bilingual are you? It's more about how well can you translate your intention into English so that the AI coder that also understands English and is fully bilingual can understand it and actually do what you want. And so
Okay.
right now we're at a stage where it's opening up to people like me who are technical adjacent or coding adjacent, but still technical, right? Like I've worked in product management and I've worked in all this stuff, but it would be foolish of me to think that this is where it's going to stop, right? And it's going to keep trickling down to less and less technical people. And so I think one of the skills that is going to become most important, like I said, is just try and translate thoughts, intentions into words that an AI can take and build off of.
Very well said there, right? So, which means, let's say, give me another 10 minutes and can wrap this up. Just to summarize a lot of what you said there beautifully is it's becoming a gray area, right? There's no clear separation of roles necessarily, right? 3 years ago, a product manager did X, Y, and Z. A project manager did whatever they were doing. An architect did this, a developer did that, a tester did this, a deployer or a DevOps engineer did something else. Now it's become quite gray, even if you talk software engineering companies per se. Because, Jose, who's a performance marketer, is actually building applications, pretty much like a developer would do, which means a developer who had to write 100 lines of code, perhaps let's say 80% of the code say can be generated, right? Not all the time 100%, but say 70% of the code. So that developer has to write 30% of the code, correct? Not the remaining 70%. They have that much more time available to do something else, for instance, which means how do you see the future of a team composition? Because I'm not seeing a clear separation between these roles. You're not hiring three developers, one tester, one part-time tester, a project manager to manage a few different projects, or a part-time DevOps engineer. So I've asked this question to many people. I've gotten some answers. I don't know of a great answer myself. I want to know what that composition should even look like.
It probably looks a lot more individual. Like it's more about what individuals you build on the team than a set. But I think more so than that, I think this might be a time for just some experimentation and just seeing what works. I was telling someone at another company, I can't think of a time. Remember Google used to have that 20% time rule where 20% of the time you could
Yeah.
do whatever you wanted. I can't think of another time other than like the beginning of the internet where giving employees 20% time would be most ROI positive,
Wow.
because a lot of the stuff that I've learned, like all the stuff that the way I've gotten better was just doing stuff for fun on the side because it was so invigorating to do the Lovable Facebook tool, that now you have me shipping Mac apps as a side project because I've been a Mac user for so long that I've had so many annoyances that I've been able to get out
Right.
uh, now. So I think I don't know what the team composition looks like. I think AI coding is too new, right? Like if you think about Claude Code is just a year old, and I would say the advancement, the update that truly has made what I'm doing possible didn't come until January of this year. So it's also new that it's probably not too early to say what a team composition should look like, but I would encourage people to just let people have 20% time and see what they come back with.
I think that's fair enough, right? I think that way it gives room for that creativity. You don't have to be an alphabet to be able to give that time. You're saying more people have to give that time, so you're going to get a lot more in return, essentially, by virtue of making that happen, right?
There's
Great.
a lot of talk about AI burnout right now, where like people are becoming so much more efficient and they're doing so much more with AI, but they're just burning out. And I think part of it is AI is a great tool. When I got burnt out on working on the database and the sync function of Meta, then maybe I would, hey, let me try this UI experiment that I've been thinking of. And so being able to task switch
No,
like
makes
that.
sense, right? So that brings me to two other related questions, which is the fundamentals of computing, correct? So in other words, people who went learn computer science, whether you want to go to college or you should, becomes a conversation that's important enough today. But are we then, Jose, saying that the fundamentals of computing, algorithms, persistence, caching, databases, things that I've, given that I've been doing this a long time, things that I've learned from my seniors, my peers, my juniors over the years, not, sometimes you hang on to some things because you've spent a lot of time and energy learning it, but things change, so you accept it and you move on. But I'll tell you, genuinely, there are things that I think will continue to be important. But before I again bias you, I want to ask you, do you think the fundamentals of computing have become less important because we are able to build software now? You actually have proved that without having to worry about caching, persistence, connectivities, whether it's everything else that we have not talked about as well. What are your thoughts?
Um, I think they will become a little bit less important, but I think they will not be not important. So knowing what to ask for, like I said, knowing translating your intention is one important thing, but the way the tools are right now, still knowing what to ask for is very important. And so that's where the matrix came from. That's a lot of where that idea of the 4 quadrant matrix came from, or congealed from, was because I was running into a lot of those issues. The meta sync issues I was talking about. Um, Later on, I was working on a Mac OS version of the same tool, and I actually had to learn about Swift concurrency and how to handle threads because of it. And that was one of the things that I didn't know I had to know. Right, that was an unknown, and I was able to pull on that thread, and that has made me gone faster in other projects. So I'd actually say knowing how a computer works is actually going to be just as important, if not more important. What you may not need to know is the details of how it actually works, but generally what it does and what to think about. The way I've thought about it, or I think about it, or talked about it with some people, is it's kind of like a puzzle box, right? Like you can still see the picture on the outside. Maybe you don't know how all the pieces fit together, but you still need to be able to keep the picture outside the box in your head.
Okay, makes sense. My last technical question for you, and then I have one non-technical question, and I'll give you an opportunity to ask me anything else as well. The last technical question is, now that, and I'm playing the devil's advocate here, right? Jose is a smart engineer, but not necessarily a programmer, right? As you mentioned. And he's been able to build this wonderful internal application that solves a real problem and brings more productivity and efficacy to the table, right? That's a fair statement to make. Now, given the fact that, let's say many years ago when I started my career, Jose, how I thought about solving and engineering a software problem, how my code quality was, the breadth of languages that I knew or had the ability to adapt to, being a polyglot engineer or whatnot. All of those were selling points for somebody to make a decision on whether Krish is the right person or not outside of the culture fit to join this particular team. Now, if I can create software by using Claude Code or Codex or Lovable or Cursor and all of these tools, what is the differentiating factor here? Jose and Chris show up at this interview. Both of them have the same suite of tools available to them at the company. So both of them can most likely build this piece of software without being coders themselves, right? Hypothetical situation, but it's a quite real situation, right? The names are
Mm-hmm.
hypothetical here with Jose and Krish, but the reality of this question is, I think it's probably there. Tell me if you think otherwise. How do we go
Yeah,
to the
no.
interview and make a differentiating point there?
Well, I think now that shipping is so easy, you're probably gonna start getting judged on a portfolio of what apps have you shipped, what does your software look like that you can show off. Um,
But that
so
was true
that
earlier too, right? When you went, you actually told people that I worked in this team, I built this, the team did X, Y, and Z, and I did a little bit of X, for instance, right? So that's not any different, is it?
No, but I think there's the opportunity to, like, I would imagine, for example, one of the reasons why I started, I don't know what this means for my career, for example, right? Am I still going to be a product? Am I just like an enhanced performance marketer, or I don't know what that looks like? But that's one of the reasons why I started doing these side apps, because I was like, oh, I want to have a portfolio of a lot of little things that I've shipped that may be outside of my big enterprise job. Here's all the stuff that I've shipped. But the other thing that came to mind as you were speaking is I can certainly imagine a coding test or a job interview at some day where they just tell you, here's a problem, like vibe code something in an hour and see how good a solution you can come up with. And you're just going to be
Already,
judged
probably,
on,
right? Because, like I've gone through
yeah.
a lot of coding sessions myself, like live coding interviews. And, I've had different podcasts that go into great lengths about what I like and don't like about them. But I was just curious, but what are you saying that makes sense, right? I was just curious to know because in my mind, right, we come to a world where things are getting more normalized. but
Right.
that doesn't change the fundamentals in my mind, right? My opinion here, for what it's worth, is when people asked us, either we are a product company, but we occasionally do managed services work as well, right, to keep the lights on. And if people
Hmm.
ask us what's your biggest skill, I've never said it's programming. It's not like Golang programming or Ruby programming or Java
Right.
programming or whatnot. I've always genuinely thought it's being having the ability to solve a wide range of problems, because the problems change all the time, right? It's, you might think you're building the same app even 10 years ago, but when it's like playing poker at a table is my great analogy that I can think of. It's the same.
Yep.
Texas Hold'em has the same rules, but when somebody leaves the table, everything changes. You've got to relearn the whole
Right.
table
Right.
one more time, right? Or if everybody is there at the table and you get a different hand, which you do every time, you're going to have to play the game very differently, right? So things are very dynamic, is my take.
And so I would say, if one of the things that's happening is people like me are coming into kind of the developer field and being able to have some skills or fake some skills because of I think maybe as a developer, a way you can also differentiate yourself is to come steal some skills from us, right? Like you said, being able to
Absolutely.
get a business course or start learning how business works. I think some of the best working relationships I've had with a developer are the ones that have a little bit more business sense, because they understand, right? Like, I don't know if that's been your experience, but in my experience, where most software projects fall apart is when there's a breakdown between what the business logic is and what is being developed. And when you can't communicate that, engineers go off and build something that, like, technically it works like it says on the paper, but like nobody caught that the logic was wrong. And so having the
No.
skills to be able to understand the business problems, I think, would be a very valuable skill to make yourself differentiate
Oh,
as an engineer.
I could not agree more with what you said there. Was it you nailed it, right? Hit the nail in the coffin there. Wonderfully said. I have a last non-technical question for you, and I'll let you have your closing comments for the podcast. But before I did that, anything else, anything you want to ask me that we've not talked about? Not, it doesn't have to be related to our conversation. It could be something else as well. Any questions you have?
uh, I'm just curious, what are some of the coolest uses of AI that you've seen, as you've had these conversations, or that you've seen other people do?
In terms of the end result, or in terms of the process of building something?
I think both, because I think for me, actually improving the process is as exciting as what the end results look like, just because it helps
Actually,
me
for
go
me,
faster.
that's more because we are a product company, right? We build APIs, publish them on AWS Marketplace, so people can build software quicker. So we have to be, we have RESTful endpoints, right? Now we're working on a layer on top, like building the model context protocol, so other AI agents can actually start consuming our APIs and doesn't have to be humans, for instance. So
Hmm.
even though we are solving the same set of problems, the way we're going to have to present those problems and provide these integrations is changing quite a bit, right? Because people may or may not want to. I mean, AI agents are not necessarily going to call RESTful APIs. They can, but they don't probably want to, right? They're going to have a different layer on top of that. But now let's say you talk about model context protocol, right? That's one thing we've been, hopefully in the next few months we'll have those published, have an MCP server. But
Hmm.
the thing that's very exciting and makes us anxious and concerned at the same time, Jose, is I saw something recently, like 2 days ago. When you run a company, you don't have a weekend, right? So I was going to say Friday. It's not actually Friday. It was actually literally yesterday morning, I think. There was an article that was like, I think titled is MCP dead, right? And I think it
Hmm.
was a context of Perplexity, or some Perplexity had used an MCP server, I think, and they ran into a ton of issues, and then they're walking back on it and going and consuming RESTful endpoints. If my memory serves me right, if these are the points, but people can definitely Google this up. That tells me that we are literally on a fast moving platform, which has always been the case with
Yep.
software engineering, right? I cannot think of a period of time in my career where things were dull and boring. It's just not the industry to be, right? Maybe there are other industries where things were slow, not the software engineering industry. It's changing even quicker, but that does not mean
Right.
that it was very slow in the past. But the fact that given that the platform is moving so quickly, it's my opinion that not everybody is getting most things correct. That's my honest to God opinion. And what I hear is what I mean by that. Generating code, yeah, it's not difficult, but does that code make sense in the context of what you're building? Needs an engineering-ish sort of mind to make those decisions, correct? Now, you telling me you don't have an engineering background, but everything you've shared with me here is exactly like how an engineer I've seen think or process, correct? But that's not to say everybody else who's coming from a performance marketing background or a product management background is able to slice and dice engineering problems the way you've approached those problems, right? To me, one of the differentiating factors, if Jose and Krish went to an interview where Krish is also a performance marketer, could be the very fact that Jose is able to break down these problems nicely. He's
Mm.
able to chunk them into smaller sizes. That would be some a way I would sell myself if I had those skills, for instance, right? But the platform is moving, things are changing quickly. Even companies that are spending hundreds of billions of dollars like Meta, on Friday they plunged like 4.3% in the market because one of the, I mean, again, they went up today, but still on Friday because they might end up using Gemini, is what it looks like. Looks like they might be lagging behind. And this is a company that hired, like, who is this? Alexander Wong, who actually started, the founder of like Scale AI. Meta might end up using Gemini, right? Because their models are lagging behind. And this is a company that's gone pretty much all out, right? Like every other hyperscaler, for instance, spending hundreds of billions of dollars. And that does not mean that they've gotten it right themselves, right? We have a graveyard of products and services, of products particularly created by these large companies like Apple. I don't know, spent like 10 some billion dollars, 15 billion or whatever the number was, an Apple car. They've been sitting out the AI phase to be only needing to integrate with Gemini, for instance. So even these large companies are making mistakes because they don't want to be left behind, right? So they are throwing in a lot of money, and I think Meta is going to let go of like 1/10 or 10% of their workforce. Could be productivity needs that was brought about to the table by AI, or it could be because they need money for capex, so they're going to go easy on the operational expenses. God knows, right? So the platform's moving, and as I talk to companies that are not that big, small startups or mid-size, or companies that are probably big but not big in the space of software engineering, I sometimes feel like there's going to be a lot of mistakes that are going to be made in the next 6 months to a year to 2 years before things course correct themselves. And the people and the companies that can make the least number of mistakes are going to find themselves in the best of positions in probably, I don't know, in the next 6 months to a year or two. So I think that's at least how I see it. I don't know. Hopefully, some of it makes sense.
I mean, it's exciting to be on the cutting edge, right? But you're on the edge because you can fall.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. Any other questions for me?
um, One thing that's been interesting to me in the AI discourse is how everybody seems to think that this need for giant data centers and cloud processing is going to be forever what's needed. And it seems weird to me because it would pretty much be the only time in history where you have to bet that a technology is not going to get smaller. So I'm just wondering what your take is on that.
Well, that's a great question. And it's a great question for multiple reasons. And one for reasons that you may not even know, which is I live in Northern Virginia. And you
Hmm.
probably know that they're building, I don't know, there's a new data center that comes up every day. And I live in Loudoun County, but I think in the adjacent county like Fairfax, I think they're looking for some approvals for like, I don't know, like an incredible number of data centers to come about in the next 6 months to a year or so, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
literally, when I drive out, Jose, every time I see a huge building, like a massive building, right? And I go to these conferences in DC every chance I get, and I talk to somebody who runs a data center, like the CEO of one of these large data center companies, and I had a pretty good chat with him. And I've talked to a few other people, so I'll share my learnings from what I've from those conversations. And if they're not specific enough, please feel free to ask me or interrupt me as well. Uh, Sorry, but I gave this background, and I want to make sure I answer the question specifically. Was there a very specific question there that I make sure I don't want to miss it? If you don't mind repeating that.
Just like it seems to me that you'd have to bet that AI is like the only technology that has not getting smaller, that has that hasn't been miniaturized
Oh,
to
got it.
believe
Got
that.
it, right?
Yep.
This is how I'm going to answer that. Imagine the worst case scenario, right? Where 3 years down the road or 4 years down the road, that in the hypothetical scenario, as unlikely as that seems, and let's say just to play the devil's advocate, this whole thing was a hype. AI
Mhm.
has been a hype. All the money spent was hype. Everything that we've learned and done, and Nvidia has a GTC conference starting today. So it's weird to talk about this thing as a hype, because I think in Jensen Huang's keynote earlier today, I think he said that earlier last year they said that there's going to be a $500 billion uh, revenue stream for them. He changed that number not by 2%, 5%, or 10%, by like 100%. Right? Jensen Huang bumped that number from $500 billion to like a whole $1 trillion. And if you looked at the chart, like you look at the Nvidia chart at like 3 o'clock this afternoon on the graph, it'll be a very interesting thing. So I'll have people do that. Not just Nvidia. Look at Broadcom or Nvidia or any of the tech companies. At 3 o'clock, if I had a bunch of money to invest at 250 and take the money out of at 3:15, it would have been a beautiful 25 minutes, right? So it just happened that way, which tells you that these large companies, hyperscalers, are sometimes trading like meme stocks, right? You got this 7%, 8% fluctuation on any given day. And given that we're building a fintech API, which is our next API, Jose, some of us are spending a decent amount of time in the stock market. So we
Hmm.
also publish these finance podcasts, right? And the reason I mentioned this is not particular for a reason. It's just that things happened at 3 o'clock today. If there was that much skepticism, you're not going to see a lot of this happen. One side, you could argue that maybe people believe in what's happening and they're just not sure. They're taking money out, putting money back, and taking money out. So, going back to what I was trying to say earlier, if everything turns out to be hype, 5 years later, you've got hundreds of thousands of square footage in all of these hyperscalers that are going to be empty, right? They're going to be, it is going to be
Hmm.
like a mall, right? The malls in America these days look like they're in an apocalyptic world, right? There are malls where there's
Right.
hardly anybody. You certainly hope these data centers don't end up becoming that. But if they, and here is a couple other things I'll add to that list. I went to a few conferences in DC with my coworker where we hear that Fortune 500 CEOs literally talk in front of us, like 5 foot in front of us, right? About a year ago, when they were asked questions about AI and CapEx investments, they gave these numbers, but when the follow-up question by the moderator was, hey, what is your ROI looking like? The answers were not very specific. You could tell, you know what I mean? They looked pretty good, the answers, but if you dig deeper, you knew that there was no specificity in those answers. I went to the same conference, the same CEOs, or similar CEOs showing up about a year later, about like 6 months or 7 months ago. They actually had better numbers. They were able to answer those questions much better. They were seeing more return on investment on those whatever they were spending, right? That's not to say that there is not a risk there, right? I mean, they asked Sundar Pichai, the Alphabet CEO, like 4 quarters ago, what is the risk in doing all this capex spend on AI? His answer, to paraphrase Jose, was the risk in not spending those billions is a lot higher than spending those
And
billions.
spending.
And Alphabet has gone up like about, I don't know, an incredible, I want to say like
Yeah.
70% in the last 6 months or so, right? And everybody's looking to use their AI models and whatnot. So I think there is that risk. But here is generally my answer when people ask me the question: are you going to bet on people like Dr. Lisa Su, Jensen Huang, Hawk Tan, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg, or Sundar Pichai or Nadella? Are you going to bet on these minds and still be wrong if they end up being wrong? Or are you going to take a contrarian perspective and believe that this thing is hype and go against all of these people that are running these incredible companies, right? I don't have the gut or the muscle in me as a software engineer and who loves this profession and the job to go against any of these people, because I love this industry, right? I love this field per se. And I make the effort to go to DC every time any of them show up in the vicinity to just hang out on the outside of these buildings. So my heart, lock, stock, and barrel is in the space that this is here to stay, right? We are all at a point of inflection, and there's going to be an incredible tsunami of changes coming. If that does not happen, I would be surprised, and I would be on the wrong side of things. But my money is on these things, right? So be it, you didn't ask about the companies that are in this space, but I know if it's worth to you or to the audience, I'll say we're going to publish a podcast because Jensen Huang blog. He doesn't blog, right? Uh, he wrote a blog like last week, I think. You can look up AI layers, 5 layers of the AI cake. I think that's the title, if I remember correctly. And I did a podcast on that article where I just went into each of those layers and picked up companies or that are in that space in that each of the layers, and I just shared those companies, right? So if somebody's interested, they can go into each of those layers and find out what are the companies that are in the energy space, in the AI infrastructure space, in the AI model space, in the AI software space, and so on and so forth, right? I know it was a long answer, but hopefully some part of the ramble makes some sense there.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, if I was skeptical before, I'm definitely not skeptical now after after what I've been able to do.
Thank you. Anything else?
No, thank you so much for the time. If you want to
Oh
check
no, just
out,
one more thing. I have a non-technical
oh yeah,
question,
go
and
ahead.
I'll have you have the closing comments. The non-technical question is: you have to go to dinner. Money is not an object. You can pick the best place, the best cuisine that you like. What would be your order for an appetizer, entree, and dessert? They all
Oh,
don't have to be part of the same cuisine, but they could very well be.
an appetizer would have to be something guacamole related.
You have
Uh,
to pick a dish, whatever it is.
oh, just guacamole and chips, and then main dish, medium rare steak, and then
Okay.
dessert, cheesecake.
That's very straightforward and simple. I understand. Even as a vegetarian, I understand that perfectly well. So I have no follow-up questions. Just by way of wrapping this up, I want to let you have the closing comments, but just
Yeah,
a quick reintro to Jose Duarte. This was an Jose. Thank you so much for taking. I really enjoyed this conversation. The specifics of
same. Thank you.
what you shared here. It was not high level, right? You went into every detail that you could share with us. Much appreciate your experience as a vibe coder. I mean, we didn't use the word vibe coding. I don't know for some reason, but that I guess literally what we spoke about is vibe coding,
Entirely
right?
vibe coding.
It's
Yes.
vibe code. It's funny that we never mentioned the word. So I guess so much for acronyms and jargons, right? They don't matter. So, folks, this is Jose Duarte. He's the head of performance marketing at Pangea Money Transfer. We'll include the links. I believe you have the links to your company and your LinkedIn profile. So happy to include that on the podcast, Jose. Thanks so much. And your closing comments, and we'll call it wraps, but just please stay on the call after we
Of
complete here.
course.
But your closing comments.
Yeah, no, I thank you so much for the time and the space. This was a really good conversation. Um, I think it's easy to scoff and point and laugh at a mistake that somebody made with AI or that a video looks a little off. But I think we have to be cognizant of what's coming. And part of the reason why I want to have these conversations is because I think there's so much change coming, and the things that people are going to be able to do, and the kind of jobs that are going to be created and changed negatively are going to be pretty big. And so the more we talk about it openly and the more we figure out what's possible and what people are doing with it, the better we can be prepared for what's coming. And I do think this is as big a change as the internet or computers, and I think we have to be ready for that.
Beautifully
And yeah,
said. Sorry, go
if you
ahead.
want to check out, what I've been able to do, I just released an app yesterday for the Mac called DockPops. It puts little iPhone folders on your dock. So it's a way to it's a new kind of launcher that I've been working on from an annoyance that I've had on the Mac for years and years. So you can go to dockpops.com or search for it in the Mac App Store and you can see it.
Yep, I just pulled it up here. Right, that's the
Yeah,
correct
so
URL,
that whole
right?
website was that whole website was also vibe coded by me.
Oh, thank you for letting us know that. I appreciate that as a developer. Amazing. Definitely, I'll include the link to this one as well, so folks can definitely download and check that out. Awesome.
Awesome.
Um, I think with that, folks, we're gonna call this wraps on this one. Again, thanks so much, Jose. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you so much.